learn from building security programs from scratch. It's really great to be here. Wonderful to be able to present for such a great conference like KernelCon. It's great to have something like this on, and it's just a pleasure for me to be up here, so thank you. Turn this thing on. There we go. All right. So my name is DiMartino. I have been in information security in one form or another for about 18 years. I started off as a consultant doing litigation support and forensics. Then went on and worked for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation as a cybercrimes analyst doing computer forensics. Moved on to be a network defense analyst with the Department of Defense. Then eventually became the manager of the security operations team at a Fortune 250. And now I'm the director of network and security operations at a technology services firm here in Omaha. So before I got the director of lobotomy, my specialties were computer forensics and incident response. Now, however, people ask me what exactly do I do here, and I take the requirements from my leadership team and I give it to security engineers. All right, so two things. One, that is the only slide transition I have in my deck, so you won't have to sit through a lot of those. But seriously, my job is to support my team as they make sure that they do what they can to support the company in its future and current goals. My top priority is to create a great security team that is also a really great place to work. I love creating effective and talented security teams that are badass at what they do and have a really good time while they're doing it. Through my career, I've been really fortunate to have a lot of really great peers and mentors in Joe Wilson, Ted Lamb, and Jairus Rue. Couldn't be here if it wasn't for the things that I've learned working with them and alongside of them. And it really does take a village. So when people talk about mentorship and growth and helping people come up, that's something I'm absolutely passionate about because as an industry, we need more people, we need more talent. And so hopefully you found that the folks that help bring you up as well. So why are you here? Security organizations are growing faster than ever, and it doesn't matter on the size of the company or the market. Everyone's being impacted by ransomware and breaches and new compliance and privacy regulations every single day. So why are companies investing in the security teams? Well, it's because they're trying to avoid the operational and reputation risk that comes with a breach and the stock price drop that comes with it. They need to meet the ever-growing list of compliance, regulatory, and contractual obligations that they're faced with. And last, they're trying to prevent breaches. Understanding the goal of your particular organization is key to being successful for building a security program, and ultimately that is your goal, is to create a security organization that can survive in your particular organization. This talk will mostly assume a supportive company, a supportive leadership staff, and I hope you have that. If you don't, some of the things that you want to do, you may have to compromise on to make sure that you can continue to at least work towards that goal, even if it isn't everything you want to do. And if you sit through this talk, hopefully I'll be able to give you a few tips to communicate the value of a robust security program so you can get some of that additional support. Okay, so specifically for this talk, we're going to talk about 3 primary phases of a program. And those 3 phases are, what did I get myself into? We'll never be able to do this, and the unicorn phase. These 3 phases are also known as assess, build, and mature and maintain. And for each of these phases, we'll also look at the people, process, and technology that's required to get that phase completed and move on to the next one. Now, for the sake of a logical presentation, I'm going to describe these things as distinct things, but they're really not. In almost every case, these phases will overlap or they'll happen out of order. But ultimately, it comes down to figuring out what you have, getting a program in place, and then setting it up for future success. So let's start with assess. For those of you seen Don't Look Up, you'll get the reference. For those of you that haven't, it's about analysis paralysis. And in this first phase of analyzing what your company needs, what you'll think is you'll never get beyond this first step because there's so much to do. But don't forget that all these phases are going to kind of happen at the same time anyway. So even as you're panicking about how to assess your company, you're going to have a lot more to worry about anyway, so it won't matter. So as you're in this assessment phase, though, context matters. So the next slide will walk you through some of the key things to consider when you're assessing a program. So the most important thing is you ask yourself, what is my purpose? But remember, it's from the context of the company or organization that you're in. You have to keep in mind your organization's purpose, and the reason why you get a paycheck is because hopefully your company is turning a profit. And even if you're a government or nonprofit, their goal isn't to have the world's best or shiniest security program, it's to complete their mission, complete their purpose, and do what they do. So you want to align yourself and your program to your organization and its goals. So how can you help them do what they need to do better with less risk? And how can you be a security champion in a way that moves the organization forward rather than constantly holding it back? You have to think about the risk appetite of your particular company. Is it a company that takes a lot of risks for the opportunities that brings? Or is it a company that doesn't accept risk and forgoes some of the opportunities they could get? Understanding the risk appetite from your risk, internal audit, or senior leadership team is absolutely vital to understanding the type and size and amount of funding that the organization can support. The next thing you want to think about is the company's current business and also the company's strategy to make sure you're prepared for what's next. Is your company looking to move into markets or business that requires, that has a lot more compliance requirements or legal requirements? Are they going to expand into countries that have a higher risk of nation-state sponsored attacks? Keeping a finger on the pulse of your company and its strategies is critical to staying ahead, but it's also important to make sure that the security team is seen not as an impediment to progress, but an enabler of safe, sustainable growth. So last, you want to make sure you can clearly define your hard and soft mandates. So a hard mandate are things like budgets and headcount, mission statement. A soft mandate is what the organization will tolerate before they riot. And those two things are very different. So the hard mandate defines your team, and the soft mandate defines how your organization responds to the controls and changes that your team proposes. In most cases, your mandate's going to be smaller than what you think it should be. But you will have time to have strategic conversations with your leadership and through, if you communicate with them in a way that they understand, hopefully you can expand that mandate as you go. So communication is key. When you start with communication, one of the first things you need to define is an executive sponsor. And it's probably not your call when you come into an organization that'll be chosen for you. If it isn't, that's a warning sign. Because the executive sponsor will drive the program from the top down. Depending on the size of your organization, it could be a CISO, it could be a CEO, CIO. It really just depends. But that person needs to clearly define the scope and goals of your program. And in turn, the security team needs to communicate the progress of the program back to that executive sponsor in those same terms. So if they say go accomplish X and you come back and say, yeah, we did Y, that's not going to do you any good. That person also needs to constantly be rallying other executives to buy into the program and drive the priority from the top down. And you have to consider the influence that this person brings in your company is going to directly relate to the amount of resources and cooperation that you get from the rest of the company, so you plan accordingly. If you have an executive sponsor that's relatively weak, you're going to have less to work with. To increase influence, every level of the security team, though, needs to build strong partnerships. This is going to be especially important when you provide your assessment to your stakeholders. Inevitably, there are going to be areas of the company that, when you assess it, is not going to look good. They're going to need improvement. And so there's no easy way to tell someone that their baby's ugly, but if you work the partnership right, you can be seen as the team that helps bring them resources and attention that they've been asking for years anyway. And what you'll end up getting out of it is allies instead of enemies. It's all about having that conversation the right way with the right people before you put them on blast in the meeting. Some other tips when you provide your assessment readout, you really want to avoid value statements. That's just saying, this is bad, this sucks, this is terrible. Have supporting evidence, have facts, have things to back it up. Be as factual as possible. Accuracy is key, because the second you say that, hey, this is a thing, and it turns out that that's wrong, you've just lost all your credibility, especially in this early phase. Avoid FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and never resort to hyperbole. Hyperbole is one of those things that can get you some early wins, maybe, but again, you're sacrificing your credibility for some early wins, and so just try to avoid it. Also, make sure you include basic risk calculations. Really, that's just likelihood times severity, right? And you also need to include estimates of the cost of addressing each issue. That's all costs, including man hours and business impact, if that's relevant. Don't forget, the people you're talking to are business people. They're not security people. They think in terms of cost benefit and dollars and cents. Your points will have much more impact if you can talk to them in a language that they understand rather than the language that you best understand. So keep that in mind. You'll also want to communicate high-level milestones and objectives. Again, matching and mirroring your executive stakeholder. Tell them what's coming, and make sure you provide frequent updates against those objectives. They want to see the results of what they're investing over time. So as you begin building your assessment, you need to look at your assets, your risks, and your resources. We're going to go ahead and start with assets. So every company has assets that they're trying to protect. You have to think about what is the critical data in your company. It could be anything from source code to process know-how. Even uptime can be considered a critical asset. And there's a lot of companies that are learning all too well just how much of an asset uptime is with the rise in ransomware. Understanding what you have and the value of that to your company will help you understand how much resources you should spend to protect it. Next, consider your compliance, regulatory, and contractual requirements, because these are table stakes for a security program. And we all know that compliance doesn't mean secure. But it's still critically important to your business objectives, because your company cannot run if it doesn't meet their most basic requirements. The goal here is to make it so that your company is just running at that level as the day-to-day. It needs to be repeatable and non-disruptful. So if you have a requirement to meet PCI, the company should just be operating that way every day, and not just when the assessor is sitting in the conference room. That's really hard to do, and it takes a lot of work. But if you have the right GRC team and the right security team, then you can get there. Next, consider business strategy. I talked about this a little bit before. Is the company moving into more heavily regulated markets? If so, you want to ramp up your program before that happens so you're ready from day one. Because again, you're proving the security team is not just a cost center, it's an enabler of the business. Lastly, what's the value of your company's reputation? If you store consumer data and you have a breach and it's in the news, what do you think that's going to do to the stock price? Or if you're primarily a business-to-business organization and you're breached, how difficult do you think it'll be to renew those customer contracts next year? And even if you can, do you think you'd renew them for the same price? Absolutely not. So next, we'll talk a little bit about risks to the assets that you've just defined. So what risks does your organization face? Are they general, or are they specific to your company or industry? Your goal really is to identify your specific company's risks, both internal and external. There are a number of sources of internal risk. One of the most challenging is tech debt. Every company has one or more systems that are too critical to ever sunset, but not quite critical enough to actually maintain. And so, or the public web server that Ted has sitting under his desk that everyone forgot about, including Ted, and it gets worse when the company sends you all home for 2 years. Internal risk can even come from your own security team. If you have an overzealous analyst, let's say Jairus, who researches malware on his corporate laptop, that's also an internal risk. Depending on your mandate, you may also be responsible for disaster recovery and backups, or even physical security. And each of those domains are going to have their own unique risks. So make sure you go through everything you're responsible for and identify each of those risks. Also think that risks aren't limited to just technology. There's process risk. Think about reviewing accounting controls. There was a talk yesterday where a company was phished. Someone told them to change their the payment destination. They did. They lost a bunch of money. Think about that. Does your accounting team validate change in payments through previously recorded contact information before they change that? That's, not having those controls in place are absolutely a risk, and that does fall under your responsibility as you build a security program. So company culture also plays a big risk. Are there a large number of disgruntled employees? Have there been layoffs? Are there about to be layoffs? Think outside the box here, because there's a lot of different ways that your company can face risks. Okay, so the next area to consider is external risks. Certain industries attract the attention of nation-state sponsored groups. Some companies are particularly vulnerable to ransomware due to tight uptime requirements. Is your company highly visible or attracting the attention of hacktivists? What about your customers? Do your customers attract that attention? Because you could be the vendor that's popped to get into their network. So again, just like all this other thing, you have to think outside the box and think 1 or 2 steps down the line. Next, consider what is your attack surface on the internet. If you don't know, I guarantee 1,000 bots do. So also don't forget to look at your attack surface between you and your customer, you and your vendors. Look across the board. And lastly, if you can afford it, have a high-quality third party check your environment for existing compromise, because you don't want to find out too late that the call is coming from inside your house. So far we've talked about what you're trying to protect and the risks that you're trying to protect it from. So let's talk about resources. What can you bring to the fight? So when you do your assessment, you need to perform a SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the people, the process, and technology of the security team, of the larger IT group, and as the company as a whole. Some areas to consider are talent and expertise. Do you have the people in your security organization that you need? Do you have people in the wider IT organization, the business? Can you bring people over from one to the other to help that? Culture. Which people and groups are going to be change agents? Which ones are going to resist and fight you at every turn? Employees, especially technical employees, can be really great security sensors. So if you have a strong security culture already, that's an asset that you can bring to this fight. Business process. Talked about that a little bit before. Do you have good business process? Is it strong? Is that a way that can then act as a robust second layer of protection? Visibility and response technology. Nuts and bolts of the security team. What's ready now? What's already operationalized? What can be ready right away? What are the things that your team is spending a bunch of time maintaining that provides you no value against the things you're trying to protect the company from? Decom those, get rid of those. It makes no sense. Think about what your IT teams are maintaining. Are there things that they're doing that your team can take advantage of that doesn't take away resources from your security team but gives you visibility or gives you an ability to respond? So the next thing to consider is who does the assessment. Do you bring an external third party? Do you not? So I'll go through a couple of pros and cons of each. If you do it internally, you'll have a greater context of the business, and it'll be cheaper for sure. But be aware that you'll bring biases, and you'll likely not even know the things you don't have expertise in, so you might miss some things too. Additionally, you have to have the time to do the assessment. And in the earliest phases of a security program, that's the one thing you don't have. The benefits of a third-party assessment is that it can bring a wider understanding of the market and your peers and an outside perspective that brings along with it objectivity. And the best part, because it's expensive, your bosses will actually listen to them. You'll also save time, which again is really critical in that early phase. But either way, I'm looking at my boss as I say that. So if you do your homework and you understand the pros and cons of an internal assessment versus external assessment, you'll be okay. Now, due to time, I haven't talked about a couple key things like cyber insurance or response retainers. Those things are important. Look into it, especially in this early phase. Specifically insurance, if you don't have much of a program in place, you want to talk about that. But yeah, there's time constraints. Okay, so at this point, if in your phase of building a program, if you haven't already begun, you'll start the build phase. Now, hopefully, your honest assessment and clear communication will have lined up the resources you need to build a security program. But if not, now's a great time to dust off your resume and apply for new jobs. All right. So this section's a little different in the build phase. It's not quite people, process, and technology. I'm going to talk about stabilization first. This is in the case where you're walking into a company that has either no program or a very, very limited program. There's some initial steps you want to take to complete as quickly as possible, and in a lot of cases, this will be happening as you're assessing because you need to get at least something on the ground. So a few things you want to think about here is triage the situation and stop the bleeding. You want to prioritize prevention that will reliably handle your commodity malware because you can't properly manage a forest if all you're doing is fighting forest fires. So I'll go into more detail in a bit about where to focus in just a couple of slides. But visibility is your next area of concern because being able to see into the environment is critical for responding to security events. But just as importantly, it's also needed to plan your investments and providing metrics of the program to your leadership team. These are absolutely necessary to provide those updates as you go. Okay, people. Early phase of building, you're looking at people from environment stabilized, you're in the beginning phases of building, you know from your assessment what are the strengths and weaknesses of your team. You'll need to make a lot of critical personnel decisions early that'll affect your program for quite a long time. If you have a very small team, you need at least a jack-of-all-trades incident responder, a really great engineer, security engineer, and someone that doesn't mind documentation and has a good pays close attention to detail. You want to maximize your team by mixing and matching their strengths and weaknesses so that each team member is better for the people that they're working with. And don't forget how important people skills are in this early phase because so much of what your team is doing is building and maintaining relationships with the other teams around you. So people skills are one of those things that you absolutely have to hire for and look for in members of the security program. So as you're establishing your team, now is the perfect opportunity to establish a positive team culture and a clear code of ethics. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. So at this point, you'll want to leverage your security adjacent teams, work closely with your platform and engineering teams, as they can be a force multiplier for the security team. And some practitioners think of internal audit as a bad word, but internal audit can really be powerful to driving organizational change and providing resources when you might not be able to get them through any other means. So be creative and be careful how you use the audit team. You will find help in a lot of places that you wouldn't expect if you focus on being a trustworthy partner. Next, get all your employees in the game by providing some basic security awareness training, phish identification, and incident reporting training. All right, process. So in the early phase, you'll be tempted to run at full speed. You'll want to tackle everything you found in the assessment, but you need to think about you need to resist that urge and really think about the process that you need to put in place. It isn't necessarily sexy, but it'll save you untold hours in the long run. So make sure your team is taking the time to define your standard operating procedures, creating documentation, and building rigor into the program. You'll likely be hiring quickly, and so if you can get this documented, it'll help you onboard team members much more quickly, but it'll also help you cross-train across the team so that as you add and lose people on the team, everyone has an idea of what's going on. Take time to set up a defined incident response procedure. I think we're all pretty familiar with how to do that, but once you're done, go beyond that. Bring in your enterprise stakeholders like legal, internal audit, compliance, even communication teams. My program has done that, and it was a little rough at first until everyone kind of figured out what role they played. But once you do, you'll have key parts of the business that are true allies that have skin in the game that are absolutely invested in seeing the security program succeed. Additionally, the perspectives that these groups bring won't be something that you necessarily realize because you don't have a legal background in most cases. You don't have an internal audit background. But here's a tip. You have to have a clear definition of which incidents make it to the larger team and which don't, because security by committee doesn't work. So if you bring your biggest, most substantial incidents to this group, you'll gain a lot of value. Next, project prioritization. Make sure you stay focused on a few key projects at a time. If you try to do too much too soon, a lot of hours will get lost into priority thrashing. Use those risk rankings that you came up with in your assessment and execute on them. Get them done, and then move on to the next thing. But besides just risk, think about the projects that will be a force multiplier for your team. Think endpoint detection and response, or EDR, and initiatives that other teams can drive, like improving the patch process or deploying security agents more completely or more quickly. Now is also a good time to get draft standards and guidelines and policies out to the company. Even if you don't have the time to build the monitoring and enforcement for these things, getting them out will hopefully lead to some voluntary adoption, but it also gives the organization an idea of what to look forward to. And hopefully the new things that they're building meet those policies, and you'll have less tech debt to tackle in the future. All right, technology. It's listed last for a reason. Technology without people and process is shelfware. It's generally a good idea to bring in technology that complements your team and complements your company rather than bringing technology and then trying to shoehorn those things into it. So where do you start? Being response ready is a good first step. A few things I'd recommend are getting a great EDR, like I mentioned before, because you can deploy it with just one push. You'll gain mountains of visibility, and hopefully it'll have strong prevention capabilities that you can get out there pretty quickly. Next, you need a method of collecting, preserving, and searching logs. And finally, a quality email security tool. Besides prevention and visibility, it'll also give your employees an easy way to report phish, and that's a great thing. So these three technologies together should give you enough visibility and enough response ready to handle almost any incident that you find from these first phases. So let's talk about the edge. We'll assume you have the basics like firewall and decent firewall policy. And yes, the castle and moat doctrine is not enough for a modern program, but it's a good first step. You'll want to get a service or technology, though, that can assess your internal attack surface. And once you get some results, you want to look into that and close those gaps right away. Don't forget to do some digging and make sure that you're the first one that found that vulnerability, and you're not missing an exploiter or a breach. Now you heard me use the term force multiplier a few times. A force multiplier really, as simply, is just anything that makes your team more effective in the time that they have. Any technology that does that for your team is typically a good investment. But be careful, not all technology is a force multiplier. A security event and incident management system is vitally important, but it's going to take a lot of time and effort to deploy and maintain. That doesn't mean it's something you shouldn't do, but when you do, just be aware that it could be a big drain on your security team resources. Conversely, a strong EDR will save your team a ton of time when responding to events. Now consider a service that is through your SIM or EDR that can monitor or triage alerting on a 24/7 basis. It's a level of protection that won't be as good as your team will be, but is likely better than what your team may be able to manage today. So consider those kinds of technologies. Now as you're working, think ahead about how each of these things that you're putting into place will be a foundation for what you're going to build in the intermediate phase and what those will rely on to be successful. Okay. So you've stabilized the environment. Now you need to start putting some real strategy together for the intermediate steps of the build phase. Be ready. If the beginning steps are a sprint, this is a sprint marathon. This phase is likely going to last much longer than the first steps, and depending on how dynamic your organization is or how many resources you have, you may never really get out of this step completely. At a previous employer, the beginning phase lasted roughly a year or two, but the intermediate phase lasted 3+. And that's been generally true at other places I've been as well. Now, when you're well into the intermediate steps, you'll begin to notice that it becomes a very iterative process. You'll be honing and refining capabilities across the security team and across the organization. And what you may find is that there are going to be components of your security program that are very mature and others that are less mature. And if those line up with your organization's risks, that means you're doing the right things. Because you want to be investing in the things that make your company the most secure, the fastest. So, like the previous section, I'll break down the intermediate steps as people, process, and technology. So again, start with people. As you look back at your assessment phase, you'll need to define the operating hours of the security team and how large the security team should be. If you have a global organization and it's one that has a high-risk technology footprint, you might want to consider 24-hour coverage, so a team that is monitoring and responding 24 hours a day. Earlier, I mentioned about subscribing to a service that provides some of that alert monitoring. And if you have a regional company or one that doesn't have a large technology risk, that might be enough for some organizations. But for multinational organizations, you should consider creating a second team in an opposite time zone. If you have offices employees already in these regions, I found that the best approach really is to directly hire people and create a second team that can cover the shifts that the US-based or North America-based team doesn't. This will provide 24/5 coverage without requiring your teams to work nights. And I really suggest that because working nights is incredibly unhealthy for the employee, and it leads to a high attrition rate. And I strongly suggest not having a night shift unless there really is no other way to operate. I've also found that badged employees tend to have lower attrition than contractors or managed service teams. And low attrition is absolutely key to keeping institutional knowledge and reducing the workload on your team of retraining people and onboarding new staff. And I have worked with managed service contracts in the past. I generally recommend against them for the reasons I just listed. However, I have found that those the alert monitoring through your EDR SIM does provide a lot of value and can cover some of those small gaps in time that your team can't be there for, specifically if you have an on-call process in place. Okay. Now, as you grow your team, you can start to provide your staff with opportunities to specialize. And I know I focus primarily on the SOC, but remember that in a healthy program, you have to take into account all the other security disciplines to be successful. And believe it or not, there are people out there that think policy and governance is fun. And I don't know about you, but I'm thankful for that. Ultimately, those things are just as important as a SOC. They will provide you the policy foundations to enforce the controls that you're trying to put in place. So if you have employees and interests in other security disciplines, encourage that because they may be the next crucial member of your team. So as you expand, continue to leverage teams outside of the security organizations that you've already been building partnerships with. Align on common goals and partner as much as you can. As you do this, help your partners. If security is seen as a team that can be counted on and trusted, you'll get close partnerships that internalize the lessons from security. At my current organization, we have architects and engineers all over the company that when they help build things, they bring a security mindset with it, and we get much more effectiveness than the security team could do on its own. All right, besides technical folks, if you have the time and resources, continue to develop your security awareness training and make sure that all of your employees are in the fight. Okay, now let's talk about process during the intermediate step. You want to focus on defining, standardizing, quantifying, and finally optimizing. Sounds fun, right? All of the tasks your team does. Your goal is to reduce the man hours required to run your service and reinvest them in other places. This starts with good process documents that are reviewed on a regular basis. Sorry, excuse me. Lost my place. And you'll want to review those on a regular basis. So at one point with the security team, I brought in everyone on a Saturday to finish off the SOPs we just couldn't quite get to. It ended up being kind of fun. We ordered pizza and had generally a good time. Jairus may disagree. But what it did is two things. One, we finished all our SOPs, and two, the team was very motivated to get as many SOPs done before that weekend as possible so they could spend less time at work on a Saturday. So once you've defined and documented your team's work, you'll want to analyze your team's, analyze what your team spends their time on. Defining the day-to-day tasks and the time that it takes to do them can be tedious, but it's absolutely necessary to make sure that you're using your automation efforts in the right places. Once you've freed up your team's resources from the day-to-day, reinvest those resources into other areas. Repeat the analyze, automate, reinvest loop until the day-to-day work is minimal distraction. This is going to take a long time, and it's going to require some advanced process engineering and development skills, but as your time begins to free up, you can put this into more project work. As you do this, just make sure that you don't oversubscribe your teams. There's really two ways to do this. The first is just giving them unrealistic deadlines. The other is a lot more insidious, and that is giving someone too many tasks than they can realistically manage. Because then all they're doing is priority thrashing and switching from task to task and not getting any actual work done. So you can free up, so use your risk model, and again, use that to keep your team focused. You can free up even more time and make your environment significantly more defensible if you convince your partners to deploy and maintain systems in a standard, secure way. Platform teams need to be able to maintain systems, need to be able to reliably deploy secure systems and detect and correct drift in your environment. Otherwise, your team is going to be fighting the same fights over and over. Ultimately, automating builds and automating configuration management will help the platform teams just as much or more than the security team, so it should be a relatively easy conversation to have. And because if you get to that point, it'll be easier to manage your tech debt because you'll be adding less to the pile as time goes on. Next, integrate your security incident management process into your company's larger incident program if it has one. By integrating, you get the benefits of relying on the training that the rest of the company receives, and if your partners already understand how to act in an operational incident, and that mirrors a security incident, they'll be more effective when you tap them on the shoulder and bring them in. Last, set up recurring meetings with your stakeholders. Have a monthly or quarterly call with legal, internal audit, platform, et cetera, to talk about recurring issues that your team is facing. The perspective and support they can bring to the table can help solve recurring issues that the security team can't solve on its own. Now, be creative in forging the alliances and building partnerships with across your organization. All right, there's a pattern. Next is technology. At this point, your key technology should be working smoothly. Less helpful technology should be decommissioned. You should have a fairly comprehensive view of your environment, and most commodity threats are prevented. That's like 80% of your program. The 20% is in the hard pile. This is where your risk analysis comes in. However, you don't want to blindly tackle the highest risk item first. Seems counterintuitive. But if your second and third priority risk doesn't represent significantly less risk, but it takes a lot less time to tackle, if you hit number 2 and 3, knock those off the plate right away, you're actually reducing risk in the organization faster than if you would have just blindly tackled the top risk. Always consider total risk in your calculations. Okay, back to the hard pile. You know you're here when it's something you can't just buy, right? You can't just buy a technology. Things like comprehensive security vulnerability management, implementing a zero trust architecture, or threat hunting. There's no tool that you can buy that does these things for any particular organization. And to complete complex tasks like the ones I mentioned, automation is going to be key for most teams. You'll struggle to scale and do these larger, more complex things unless you have automation in place. And hopefully, as you've been building the program, you've already invested in automation in earlier phases, and you'll have some amount of framework to build off of as you get to these harder things. Good example is SVM. My team was already doing automated asset management and had created integrations with the company's business intelligence system. So when it came time to do SVM, the team was able to use those existing integrations to validate the initial scanning coverage, send reports to the teams who own systems with findings, but they also were able to leverage the discovery of the SVM tool to improve their asset management, but then also able to find gaps in their other security tools. Now, I'm standing up here and I'm talking like this was easy. It absolutely wasn't. It took hundreds of hours from incredibly talented people to get this into place. But my point is, it's worth the investment. It's worth giving your team the time and the focus to create things that they're going to use over and over and over again. It also won't be an easy sell to leadership. I know, because I stole resources from our SVM program to make this happen. I dedicated a body to build out the to build out the automation framework, and this goes directly in contradiction with what I said about open, honest communication with your leadership team. But at the time, I didn't have the experience necessary to be able to fully explain what I was trying to do. And you know, at the end of the day, though, I trusted my team, I trusted my gut, and it worked out very well. Sorry, Joe. As I mentioned before, the intermediate phase is incredibly difficult, and it's going to take a lot of time. And very likely, you'll never really be completely out of this phase for all the different parts of your program. However, I do want to touch pretty briefly on the maturing and maintenance part of the program as well. Okay, so this meme doesn't fit what I'm talking about, but I needed a Firefly meme, so I just threw it in. Congratulations, not everything's on fire. You can rest, relax, bask in your success. Yay, except you can't. Because the truth about security, just like life, is that the only constant is change. You have to adapt. Just when you have, public cloud secured, now come serverless workloads and containers. And if you don't want to retrofit everything your engineering and platform teams are building, security has to be a willing partner from day one. But you can get there by focusing on people, process, and technology. All right, as always, people first. So I'm going to get a little preachy in this section, because people are the thing that I'm most passionate about. Attrition is a killer. You all know that. I'm sure, especially lately, we have all lost folks in our teams. But in order to help reduce attrition, knowledge workers need autonomy, mastery, and purpose. It was brought up last night at the CISO piece. Now, this isn't mine. It's from a wonderful book called Drive by Daniel Pink. If you manage people, you absolutely need to read that book. It's fantastic. Autonomy. You'll find that just about everyone can make good decisions if you give them some guardrails and some guidance. Employees will turn into great leaders and wonderful mentors for the less experienced members of the team with just a little bit of nudge. They'll be self-driven, and they'll get way more done than if you tried to direct everything that they do. Mastery. People need to feel like they're good at something, and they have an opportunity to get better. You have to make sure your team has the time and the time to focus on improving their craft. So as a leader, protect that time fiercely and make sure you work that into your capacity. Purpose. We all need to feel like we are part of something bigger and we have something meaningful that we're contributing with our lives. Everybody's different, so everyone's purpose is going to be different. It's your responsibility as leaders to help people connect with what their purpose is in your particular organization. And it's especially important for you to look at that within yourself and find what your purpose is in your day-to-day. Ultimately, fulfilled employees are self-motivated and creative, which make them amazing security professionals. All right. To complement autonomy, mastery, and purpose, the next thing you need to establish is a strong culture. You should set and hold high expectations of your team and communicate them clearly. People hate unclear expectations. One of the cultural values that I find most rewarding is looking at failure as a chance for growth and learning. Let your team make mistakes without fear and then guide them towards the lesson when they do stumble. Lastly, allow an environment where everyone, no matter the level, no matter how long they've been with the company, can constructively challenge, criticize, bring up ideas with anyone else at any other level. It's really the only way that you will take advantage of the diversity of thought and diversity of background of everyone in your organization. Lastly, as security professionals, there's one area that none of us can fail, and that is ethics. We have a trusted role within our organizations, and we have access to mountains of sensitive data. Collectively, we cannot tolerate lapses in ethical judgment. Make sure you let your team know what those bold red lines are and hold them accountable if they cross them. All right, happier note. Continue to hone your risk rankings, and as you get more and more down the path of maturity, you're going to start addressing risks that haven't even happened yet. Think about what I talked about aligning to your company's strategy. Start addressing risks that they're going to face later, because if you're there from day one, you'll be in a better spot. Continue to integrate security as early as you can into every process you come across. And for long-term success, the secure path should be the easy path. And the earlier security is built in, the less friction it will add to the various processes across your company. And last, technology in the maturity phase. As I said before, but only because of how critical it is, automation. It's really the only way your team will be able to scale with your business. And at this point in your team's maturity, you should be able to use automation to tie all your tools together, cross-check security coverage, create a self-healing environment, like automatically reinstalling agents, things like that, adding context for incident data, and in some cases, even doing basic repeatable incident response actions. So it sees something, pulls the email out of the inbox, you name it, blah, blah, blah. But metrics are also a great use of automation. It's one of the areas that I think it works the best. Create dashboards for the security team so they can see the status of their tools from one screen. They can see what's outstanding, what jobs are there, but also for your leadership team. I want to be able to see how is my team doing. What are the red blinky lights? I'm a director, right? I've had a lobotomy. I need red, yellow, green. But also performance metrics for the other leaders in the company. They need to be able to see at a glance how is their team doing, meeting the requirements of the security program. And if you provide them, Power BI or some other report that says, hey, your team is really falling behind on SVM, if they're able to see that, they can take action of that. They can take action on that. And if your partner teams are ready, you can start implementing security as a service. I have a couple great examples of this. You can create API endpoints that your platform and engineering teams can use to leverage your service. So for instance, you have a platform team that does automated builds. Give them an API endpoint so they can pull the latest security tool, the latest security agent. It's pretty cool. You can also set up an API endpoint to kick off a vulnerability scan. So before a system gets pushed into production, they can kick off a vulnerability scan and make sure that the system is secure before it's promoted. And finally, don't forget to continually assess your tools and your vendors. There's pros and cons to going with best of breed versus all from one vendor. Every organization is different, every team is different, but just make sure you think about it and don't just get complacent with the tools you have in place. Always consider what's next. All right, last slide, summary. I've gone through a lot. I appreciate your time, and I hope you found value in some of the things that I talked with you today. Ultimately, the key concepts that I hope you've taken away are that in order to build a successful security program, you have to align with your organization and be an enabler of its success. You need to carefully identify your risks, your assets, and the resources, and plan for them, and then build a program that reduces the risk to your organization's assets by using the resources at your disposal in a strategic way, first by putting out the fires, and then by managing your forest. Last and most importantly, take care of your people. Process and technology will not get you anywhere if you don't have talented people that care about the program. So take care of them, and they will be motivated, and they will be effective. So thank you again. I think there's a few minutes left for any questions. Appreciate the time today, everyone. Yeah.
So we talked a lot about making partners and allies. How do you start those conversations with different departments proceeding to progress?
Time, it's time. And, you know, it's about coming to those meetings with empathy, understanding their point, understanding what they're coming from, understanding the resources that they have to bring. No one in the company is going to have unlimited resources, right? They can only focus on so many things at a time. That's why I talked a little bit about aligning on the things that, you know, they want to do and you want to do, things that they can do that can move the security program forward. That's the key, is really coming and being a partner, but also, like I said, limited resources. If the security team can help them in some way, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, you ask for favors, but I am half Italian, so favors are a thing. So if you help them, they owe you a favor, you know. So really, it's empathy. You know, be a partner, be trusted, be vulnerable. You know, share the areas that you're struggling, and there's a good chance they'll share the same, and then hopefully you can help each other. Any other?
In your experiences over time of these steps, what have been some of the biggest challenges?
Resources. I think resources is always the biggest challenge, because as much as you want to look forward, businesses aren't willing to pay for things they're not doing yet. And so funding always tends to be I was going to say a couple of years, sometimes it's not quite that long, but funding's always behind where you need to be. So if the company wants to get into, let's say, public cloud, you're not going to get engineers for public cloud until about a year after you're already doing public cloud. And so it's really about how do you figure out how to do that automation, get things to a place where, you know, you can, hopefully your day-to-day isn't drowning you so much that if something comes out of left field, you have something to dedicate to it. And if it's a project you're kind of pushing off, that's a lot easier than saying, oh, I'm going to push off ops. You can't push off ops. You can't just ignore a fish because you got to go secure cloud. So if you can make those day-to-day things a little more manageable and give you some breathing room, then you can flex a little bit better. Any other questions? Oh, jeez. All right, Ty.
What happened with the web server at that guy's desk?
I think we fired that guy. Any other questions? No? All right. Oh, did you have one?
How do you convince them of the value of the security work to enabling growth, as opposed to it being considered a net drag on productivity and cost and scheduling and all of that?
It's tough. It's tough, but it's in that assessment phase, and it's not like the assessment phase ever stops. So I want to, you know, the way I made it sounds like, oh, you're done doing assessment. That never really stops because the risk is always changing. So it's part of a security program to continually to review that. But what you do is you take that clear, honest assessment of the risks and, you know, the likelihood of those risks happening, the cost of those risks happening. You start to put that together, and that paints a picture of how much would it cost if that happened. What is the likelihood of that happening? And you start to say, if we invest this much, we can reduce the likelihood of that thing. I mean, that's the whole point of a security program, right? Is clearly communicating, here are the risks, this is what it's going to cost if it happens. So if we invest this, we can hopefully avoid that. Otherwise, we have cyber insurance. So that's worked for us. You know, not all leaders respond in the same way, and so you have to look at your leaders, you have to look at your organization, and adjust your message for what resonates with them. Some people are very data-oriented, some people aren't. And then, you know, for the people that aren't, sometimes you do have to go with some of that hyperbole, but I wouldn't recommend it. Answer your question? Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
In respect to ethics, what do you think is often overlooked?
In respect to ethics, what?
What do you think is often overlooked?
I don't know if it's overlooked, but I think discretion is the one that's hard because, you know, everyone in the security team is on one team. And so you talk to each other, and you got to think in terms of the thing, you know, if you're working on a particular investigation, you talk to your buddy about it because you're both on the security team, but they don't necessarily have the need to know. And so I think discretion is one of those things that I think teams kind of overlook sometimes. They just forget because they're all in the same security team. So I think I have like 1 minute left.
No, you have to be done.
Oh, all right, I'm done.
The next speaker needs time to split the setup.
All right, thanks everyone.